Hello, welcome to Politflix episode 4, or is it 5? I don't know, even I've lost track. The idea being to take some political themes, some movie news, and look at specific franchises in no particular order. I'm joined today by Dave Bond. Hello, Dave.
Hi.
And what we're looking at today is the Terminator series. Context here is, well, Arnold Schwarzenegger celebrated a big birthday. He was 70 a couple of weeks ago. There is talk at the moment, obviously, of the franchise continuing to be redeveloped because James Cameron is getting the rights back, and he's obviously played an integral role in this development of the 3D re-release of Terminator 2. And I think it's a franchise that, although not as beloved or as big as certain others, certainly its first two are pillars of cinema history and plenty to talk about in terms of how it was developed and how perhaps it didn't go according to plan and how it can maybe be saved. So, if we start, Dave, with sort of film news or anything like that, anything stuck out for you during the week in trending topics?
I don't think there has been an awful lot this week. I'm continuing to see the odd sort of set photo from the Han Solo film.
And what's your
And
feeling on that? What's your instinct? Do you think that they've got, do you think that the trouble that they had is secretly a lot bigger than they're letting on? Is Ron Howard basically having to start from scratch, do you think, behind the scenes?
well, I mean, if he's going to have a director credit, he's got to direct 51% of it. So that tells you something. If you're replacing him, you are admitting you're going to have to reshoot a majority of it. I heard that the Lord and Miller tone was far too comedic.
Yeah.
For what they wanted to do. My only worry, I mean, I do accept that there will be a sort of effectively an overdose of Star Wars now, and that we'll have one every
Saturation.
year.
Is that what you
Yeah,
said?
yeah. Well, I don't know if saturation would be the word, because I can't see us at the moment getting 3, 4, 5 a year. I think one a year is not saturation necessarily, but we are at a point where they will inevitably become less special. What worries me with these sort of Star Wars stories, the years between the numbered installments, is I just think there'll be a tendency to overtell. That we don't need to know the background of everything.
Yeah.
I'm open-minded on any individual release, and that I'll go in to see this film hopeful and ready to watch it, but
Yeah.
don't necessarily need his background.
Well, I think
I certainly don't. I mean, he's not such a bad example. I certainly don't want Boba Fett's background.
no, but I mean they tried that and they stuffed it a little bit with the prequels because I think the idea of people are obviously very harsh on why did George Lucas draw so much on the originals. Well, I mean for me, the idea with the prequels, for all of their flaws, was that it was a way to somehow dramatize the idea of more adventures in the Star Wars universe that were not that sort of a day in the life of these characters before the Civil War, if you like. So still war. Obviously, it's not Star, as I've joked before with haha Star Peace, but it is kind of a day in the life of the Jedi, a day in the life of a bounty hunter, and then those points converge in sort of the changes in the galaxy. And I think maybe with some of these standalones, they're doing that slightly better. Rogue One was on the other night, and that captures for me that sense of, right, this is a huge universe, people have been writing this kind of fan fiction and role play stuff, this is the type of thing that we wanted to see as kids, we wanted to see more Star Wars, and the fact that they had to repass and repackage the original trilogy and then the prequels again and again because there wasn't that, it's kind of a relief to see the new content. Obviously saturation is a concern, but I think if they're doing it in such a way, a bit like Marvel, where each one, okay, yes, ostensibly it's either a comic book movie or it's a Star Wars movie, but if they dip into a differing genre each time within that, the idea being that the original Star Wars is a Western, it's a war movie, it's a fairy tale, you can take any of those aspects and you can, technically speaking, take any genre, short of actually adult thrillers. I don't think we're ready for a Star Wars meets Basic Instinct quite yet, but what I'm saying is within limits you can do anything with that universe, and provided it is a good story and it's well made, the comforts of the sights and the sounds and the sort of the slight whiff of nostalgia, but also the novelty and the idea that this is a series about passing a torch anyway. The idea of generations being able to share this experience as a new mythology. Bear in mind, mythologies can last hundreds of years, thousands even anyway.
They certainly
You
can,
know,
and I don't necessarily have a problem with Star Wars being, back and new films being made. But the anthology entries, they're not called that anymore. They just call them whatever the title is, a Star Wars story. But the interim years between the numbered, those entries worry me more,
yeah,
because I just think it'll there'll come a point where we'll know Jabba's every last fucking bowel movement. You know, not everything needs to be on the screen. Not everything needs to be told. And sometimes a bit of mystery in someone's background is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And if you're constantly giving us backstories of characters from the sort of Lucas films, if you like, then I think you are wasting the potential of this universe. Rogue One felt different because it felt like it was plugging a story gap, not a character histories gap.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And if anything, one of the problems with that is it doesn't have a character.
Largely positive.
Yeah.
It will be largely positive.
So you're going to do them back to back. One of the things you've debated, because obviously the Do You Expect Us to Talk podcast. Sorry, I forgot to plug it at the beginning. But the idea is that you're going to go through the series. You're already debating: do you start with episode 1 or do you start with episode 7? Do you start with episode 4? You could start anywhere.
Well, I know where we are starting. If that's what you're asking, we're going to do them in release order, which was my strong preference all the way along. Because when you come to episode 1, I wouldn't. Episode 1, episode 7, both of them have elements that they're aping from previous releases and episodes that they're rhyming with previous releases. And I think that you need to review them in the context of that.
Why are people so brutal about that rhyming?
If you're talking about the youth of Anakin Skywalker,
yeah,
without really supposedly knowing where he's going, and in inverted commas, it's.
I mean, rhyming in itself isn't actually a problem because I think every franchise has to do that.
I quite like that about it.
Yeah.
Obviously, the danger rhyming, if you like, is kind of a dangerous approach when your product is weaker because all it's going to do is remind you of better films.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem, is the execution.
Certainly, I can't watch Attack of the Clones with the asteroid field without thinking of Empire. So all that has done is reminded me of a better film.
Yeah, and sadly, a lack of character payoff, and this is where kind of character comes in. Because talking of Rogue One, I mean, plot-wise, yes, and as a war movie, and in terms of texture in the universe and execution, all fine. What it lacked, I think a lot of people pointed out, was to some extent a kind of a linking character that was on a par with your Han Solos, whatever. And the prequels, in Episode 1, they lack that. And to be fair, this is where I'm sympathetic to George Lucas, because it's not that he failed to read criticism, because he not only read it, he responded to it. But you can see where he's kind of overdoing the response to it.
By Revenge of the Sith, he had Tom Stoppard working with him on dialogue and stuff.
But the episode 2...
was very keen to address the perceived faults.
He is, but he's almost overdoing. Like one of the criticisms of episode 1 was that it lacked the Harrison Ford factor. It lacked a Han Solo. So his response, and I can see it now in a way that I couldn't before, as I was watching it the other, because they're rerunning them all on Sky, and I just couldn't resist because it was quite late at night and I was knackered, and I decided to watch them all each night, one after the other. And it got to, I think it was in episode 2 and 3, where people are very critical of Lucas's direction, and particularly of Hayden Christensen's delivery. I now think, I don't have any authority for this, but I just think he's being directed, I think, or not necessarily directly, explicitly, but it's as though Lucas sat him down and said, rewatch Harrison's movies. Try and be a bit more Harrison Ford. Make Anakin more into the Han Solo. Whereas, in fact, Hayden is his own guy. He's a great actor. He's done some great work. But in his bid to be a cross between this kind of James Dean frustrated youth, the beginnings of a prototype Darth Vader who's starting to talk even before the burning a bit robotically, and have a kind of a casual grin and a sort of a who. Like there's this moment with Padme where she says, they're trying to do banter. Oh, it's because I'm so in love with you abundantly. He goes, that's not exactly what I meant. And it's beat for beat exactly how Harrison would deliver it. And it just doesn't work.
Actually, his dialogue is his speech patterns are mimicking James Earl Jones.
Is that right? Fantastic.
If you watch Anakin and just try and hear it in Vader's cadence.
Yeah, which is genius in a way, but also incredibly stupid because,
it's a great idea.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things you do a handful of takes of and just think, no, that's not working.
Yeah, but that got me thinking as well. I mean, another mistake that they make similarly, Ewan McGregor, of course, it was inspired casting as Obi-Wan. And I remember when I heard about it, because our old friend Kenneth Branagh had been rumoured for years, which is fine, because I can see that. I can totally see it. But when I first heard about Ewan, this was 1996, I think 97. I think Empire magazine ran a sort of a superimposed picture of his train spotting head onto the Alec Guinness picture from from the cockpit of A New Hope in the Millennium Falcon. And he's sat next to Han Solo, and just got me thinking at the time, because the only thing I'd seen him in was obviously Train Spotting and Shallow Grave, and I was thinking, yes, I can see what they're going for here. They're going for the idea that Obi-Wan Kenobi, in his youth, was actually not this staid, wise old wizard. He was a bit of a lad. He is going to be the Han Solo of the piece. And if anything, he may even be kind of a bit, not quite a scoundrel, but there's this moment in A New Hope where Han Solo is mouthing off about the Force and taking the piss out of it. And Obi-Wan Kenobi does a very interesting thing. It's very Alec Guinness, I think, and kind of metatextually, my old phrase. He kind of, in a comment on what Alec Guinness perhaps felt about Star Wars, he's smiling as if to say, yes, I know what you're saying, but no, I don't necessarily accept it. And in an inverted way, I was thinking, was he sort of thinking, well, when I was a young character, a young Obi-Wan would have been more like Han, a bit more cynical, a bit more kind of rugged and ready. So the sad thing about the way Ewan is directed to play Obi-Wan is that obviously maybe it's partly because of the accent, which equally is something I think they could have dropped. They could have retconned it and said he developed an English accent to get away from the Empire or something. But he's playing an old man in a young man's body, which doesn't really quite take off. And when you consider that by episode 2 and 3, Lucas is trying to make Anakin a bit more kind of hip and, organic too, the two things just don't quite fuse. They should have been chalk and cheese. So they've put all the structures in place, like the detective buddy cop stuff, which a lot of people hate. I love it. I think the idea of A Day in the Life of Jedi is great.
What it's trying to do.
Yeah, but the two of them,
they're
they're so similar almost, and then they keep swapping. So who's the earnest one? Who's the rogue? Who's the rookie? Who's the wise old mentor? Who's the really profound one who's into the Force? And who's the more kind of human, normal one? But I do think that this forthcoming Obi-Wan film, which has been announced now, although bizarrely they haven't announced Ewan yet, which has obviously sent the internet on fire, because he wasn't at Star Wars Celebration, even though everybody else was at Star Wars Celebration. Even Dennis Lawson, his uncle, who shunned Star Wars, turned up at it. But maybe it's for a separate announcement. But I think they could fix a little bit of that, in the sense of just having Obi-Wan living more of a kind of a rogue's, adventurer's existence, whilst at the same time developing the skills that will turn him into this sage, wise old man from the cave, and having a self-contained adventure that has enough stakes to propel him into it. It doesn't have to connect at all with ultimately what's going to happen in episode 4. You don't need to even have the Empire in it, technically. You can have them in the background. You could even have a moment where he sees a hollow net thing where they announce that Darth Vader is back or something, and then he clicks, oh shit, Anakin is still alive, and he prepares himself what will be his inevitable death. And you could even have a cameo from Liam Neeson actually coaching him, a la Luke and Yoda. But
yes, I do think that. I mean, the first film, I felt quite sorry for Ewan in the first film, because I felt that basically he had to sort of stand on a ship and look a bit intense.
Yeah,
that's all. And actually, all the personality was coming from Qui-Gon.
Yeah,
actually. And perhaps that may have been the wrong way around, I don't know.
But once again, I mean, if you think about Liam Neeson has a Harrison Ford quality. So once again, it was so close to working. It's just that the bits weren't kind of sewn together correctly. If you take the individual segments out and you remix them, and this is why I think it's, in a way, their flaws have become an entertainment in themselves. We talked about, Plinkett before, who does it in a very funny but very educative way, but entire YouTube industries of people saying this is how I do the prequels. And of course, the fact of the matter is we're all armchair film directors and writers, and we'd all do things differently. But this is always going to run, which is that there was so much wasted potential, but also so many moments of near perfect genius, which in themselves make, I think, all of those three films worth watching. I don't hate them by any means.
I think the biggest, forget his writing ability for a minute, because the biggest mistake he actually made was writing and directing them himself. He's much better in that old exec producer role. Exec producer kind of almost being more of a TV concept, but as you would understand it in that regard. But the way he always used it was sort of creative controller, really, with sort of a director working to him. But his biggest flaw with those films, apart from whether they should have been there in the first place, but the one that springs to mind is Lucas's completely chaste and legal, by the way, obsession with young children.
Yeah.
Anakin should not have started at 8-9 years of age. There's your problem.
Is that just cynical marketing?
To
sell toys?
I just think you look at the making of Last Crusade.
Yeah.
The River Phoenix scene. And as we talked about, and you expect us to talk, if Lucas had completely got his way, that would have been let's see him when he's a little kid. And that's just Lucas's sensibility. I mean, he adopted 3 kids. I think he's adopted 1 recently, but in that time,
yeah, he was obsessed with the idea of legacy, wasn't he? And the thing that I think taking the hero's journey almost literally, the idea that, because we talked about this last time, was the idea that George, I think, has an idea which is valid if you're not doing franchise filmmaking. If you're doing something like the about after sunset, after midnight, or whatever,
before sunset.
Yeah, and the idea with that is that they revisit the characters every decade. But as you pointed out, Dave, you can't do that and you can't have your cake and eat it, and sort of say, well, I want to do a big franchise film, which is going to require by studios or investors episodes every couple of years, and do kind of the life story bit of sort of dipping in and revisiting characters during childhood or adolescence or adulthood, or you can have little flashbacks.
I just think it's very difficult to lead a film with a 9-year-old. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
I felt very sorry for Jake Lloyd over the years because he's struggled ever since with the sort of legacy of having done this film.
He's a schizophrenic, isn't he, now, sadly?
He is a schizophrenic now. I can't lay that one at the feet of George Lucas, but he was definitely an unhappy child and an unhappy man.
Yeah.
From his experiences on this, I think a lot of the problem is then you're pairing him with a 16-year-old actress, albeit playing 14, in Natalie Portman at the time. I'm talking at the time of filming.
Yeah.
She was 16, she was about 18 when it was released.
Yeah.
And it's just a mismatch because in the next film you've got another actor who looks nothing like Jake Lloyd in any way, shape or form.
No, that's right.
The funny thing is, if you put a photo of, like, they were showing during the making ofs, photos of, they had reference photos of Luke from episode 4, and they were putting the last 2 young actors' photos next to him. And actually, I thought Jake Lloyd, I could see enough of a resemblance that I thought I could see that. But of course, he didn't even look like his older self, and then it becomes a romantic thing when they were,
Yeah, well, I suppose it is fantasy and so on, and maybe people age differently in space or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, people sort of noted, oh, is that a bit creepy? Well, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily creepy because obviously as a kid, you generally tend to have a crush on somebody who is older.
You're not. But when they're 16 and you're 9, I wouldn't expect them to be romancing you 8 or 9 years later.
No, and it's funny that doesn't tend to happen. I mean, one can obviously romance people who are older or younger, but you don't tend to have known that person as a...
Had it been 30 years later, maybe.
That would be interesting. And if she'd been a much older one...
different people then. I mean, if a 38-year-old Anakin... I mean, I'm not saying I wanted this in Star Wars, by the way, but just from a moral perspective, a 38-year-old Anakin and a 44-year-old Padme who knew each other when he was a child, I don't think would have been a problem.
It's not actually that flippant to say so, because one of the things that... I thought was kind of IMDb trivia lore and thereby not necessarily entirely accurate. But she confirmed it in a Facebook post, I think in around 2012. There's an actress who I'm very fond of her work for many, many reasons, called Sybil Danning. And Sybil was sort of a star of a certain B-movie, but kind of fun B-movie type fairy tale fantasy action fare around the 1980s. And it's an open secret that George Lucas was he had a number of different moments where he thought about going into prequels. He finally committed to it in 94, but around the 80s, he had a phase where he was thinking, I'll do it now, in the late 80s. And I don't know if there was a full treatment, but there were apparently semi-official discussions with Sybil Danning about the idea of her playing a kind of a Sith witch who would tempt, not a young Anakin, but a slightly older Anakin, towards the dark side. And I'm sure execution-wise that probably wouldn't have worked, but it's an interesting prospect. And I think one of the things that...
I'm looking at photos of her now.
Yeah, it could take you maybe there.
She's what happens when Barbara Bach and Patsy Kensit fall in love.
Yes, isn't it a lovely, lovely, lovely sight?
Yeah, okay.
Yes, Sybil. So the idea was to maybe get it back to those quite deliberate B-movie credentials, because one of the other problems I think with Star Wars as a series, certainly from in the sense of a weakness being a strength and vice versa, if you have multiple genres that you can touch on and you have multiple kind of types and templates, you could easily take the B-movie template, as they did with Indiana Jones, and with a decent director and, I suppose a more playful writer, you can somehow invert that and make it an almost a movie game. What you can't do is tell the entire history of cinema in one particular series of films. And I think one of the things people forget about Lucas and the movie brats generally, Spielberg less so, because Spielberg is able to draw on inspiration while still being original and tell a self-contained story. But Coppola, Lucas, to some extent Scorsese, certainly Brian De Palma, they're archivists of film as much as they are filmmakers. And they love this idea of what he calls jazz riffs, of let's just dip into a genre, template it onto something else and see if it works. And frequently it doesn't work. I mean, it's what bankrupted Coppola financially. And Lucas was in no such risk because, frankly, you could literally have somebody reading the phone book, but in the Star Wars universe, and it would make some sort of money return. But he was being quite random from day one about what he was going to put into it, because he just fancied, right, I've got an idea today, it might look like this. If he had had access to Facebook back then, he would have simply set up a Facebook group and said, these are the kind of ideas I have for maybe where I'm going to go with Star Wars. And he would never have ended up writing it. He'd just said, he'd have posted lots of pictures or something of the actresses he thought about casting in it or something. But, So there are lots of what might have been, but I think it's not just Star Wars that has this at the moment, this idea of the things that what might have been fan fiction a generation ago is now a sort of a subdivision of industry within a studio. Because have you heard about the new Joker film, speaking of Scorsese?
Yes, I'm freaking horrified.
But it's out of continuity, so it's got nothing to do with the DC EU. It's got nothing to do with Batman.
But it's just...
They're just going to use the term Joker.
Getting the universe right first.
Yeah.
But I think also it's again, stop trying to give everything a fucking explanation.
Yeah.
And it's also, I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio was the first name floated in Nolan's direction when he said yes to doing Rises.
Yeah.
Without knowing what was in it or who was in it or whatever.
Yeah.
It's the laziest studio going, he's a bankable star, let's just put him in. And it almost doesn't matter what the role is. Could it be good? Yes. It's got Leo in it, you don't know who's going to direct it, it's got, sort of Scorsese involvement. It could be great, but I just think artistically, the last thing you give a backstory to is the Joker.
Yeah.
But
unless, of course, you do literally film The Killing Joke, which kind of does that. And I think...
because The Killing Joke is finishes with that line about, I like my backstory to be multiple choice or something like that.
Which Nolan actually references with the multiple stories.
It could be a load of bollocks.
Because in The Dark Knight, the idea is he's basically Satan. He's just evil. There's no reason for him. And he plays with that idea of multiple origin stories within the thing of sort of, do you know how I got these scars? And then, I know how you got these. Was the idea that he would constantly tell the story to provoke a reaction, be it sympathy or whatever.
But that does come straight from the comics. It comes from, The Killing Joke did postulate kind of almost like a Red Hood kind of storyline, wasn't it?
Yeah. Now it's going to be an 80s set piece, which is interesting, because I can certainly picture that kind of lighting and music and a hard-edged, maybe gangster thriller in which a stand-up comedian gets on the wrong side of and ends up becoming somebody who can outdo them as a serial killer. And there's no doubt that Leo is at a not dissimilar stage to, I suppose, what Jack was. I mean, if Jack Nicholson had played the Joker even 5 years previous to when he plays him, he'd have looked physically a bit more like the comic Joker. Because one of the problems with Nicholson's Joker is he doesn't look a lot like him.
Second half of the 80s.
Yeah. So, and if he'd done it earlier, just at a physical level, I think he'd have been more of a physical threat. And although the Joker is not presented as a physical threat in the way, say, a Bane or whoever is presented to Batman or a Deadshot or whatever, I think some physical presence. And I think Leonardo, although he's not necessarily an action star, and he hasn't filled out quite to Brando levels. He's at a good stage. He's not hit 50s. He's what, 42, 43?
Yeah,
hey, he could even, he could credibly. It's the kind of age at which you can still get away with playing Bond. So, speaking of which, did you heard the good news? Obviously, Daniel doing a fifth.
Yes.
Which wasn't a surprise, but it was a surprise the way he dropped it. Bit of class.
I knew he was going on Colbert, and it was strongly rumoured he'd be doing it there. So
yeah.
By the time it came about, it wasn't a surprise.
Yeah.
But I think I heard about that. Someone will correct me. Maybe he wasn't even announced this early, but I think I knew about 6 days before he went on Colbert that he was going on there. And I think I knew at that point that's when it would be announced. Someone may correct me and say, oh, no, they only announced it 3 days before, but it was something like that. And so I knew it was coming. What we don't know is any of the other detail, obviously, and that's some time away yet because the film is over 2 years away.
Yeah, and thankfully the clickbait seems to have abated very briefly. I'm not seeing lots
I
of.
do feel sorry. I feel somewhat. Sorry is a relative term in this case, but I had some sympathy for Daniel Craig. I think he hurt himself with some of the stuff he said, but I had some sympathy that you've just worked for a couple of years on a film.
Yeah,
He had some production authority on that film as well. He worked in development of it. He injured himself badly making it. He had to stop to have knee surgery and everything else. He finishes it, presents it to the world, sits down ready to discuss it. And people say, "You're going to do another one, and who would you like as the next James Bond?" And it's just this constant obsession with the next Bond film all the time. And at least with this one being 2 years away, maybe that will, the focus will be on the rumour mill around this film. Yeah. But you can guarantee as soon as he goes to sort of sit in sort of these junkets to promote the film, he'll be asked consistently about the next James Bond if they have not pre-announced.
Yeah, which would be insane as well anyway, because the one thing you don't do marketing-wise is say anything about the next one while you're trying to promote the existing one. I would have thought would have been, they don't actually have these kind of very gentlemanly baton handings. And the reality is, I think it will be his last, not necessarily due to an inability to do another on or age, but just out of, you very elegantly put this last time, which was the fact that, yes, of course, he could age a little bit like an Inspector Morse or so on, but the nature of the Bond fantasy and character, first because Ian Fleming either didn't live long enough or wouldn't have anyway in the first place done a very final Bond story in which we know there's a finite ending to the character.
The only time he nearly did that was from Russia with Love.
Yeah, and he regretted it, brought him back. And the second thing is, obviously, as you point out, it's a going concern. They have to keep making them, and what they're making is a fantasy about a man who is defined by being perpetually 30 to 45, because that's the demographic it appeals to. By the time a viewer gets beyond that age, they maybe look back to halcyon days occasionally, but they're no longer vicariously simulating or trying to copy what they see. Whereas from the time you're an adolescent through to the time, as I say, you're kind of a more grown-up sort of a person, Bond and the fantasy of being that, not callow youth, you're not the Luke Skywalker, who's entering the world, but you're a sort of and this is where Indiana Jones has the overlap, the idea of you're a competent elder statesman in mindset, but you have the body to physically still be able to kick ass and seduce women who are your age, if not slightly younger, or older, indeed, but, that's...
Yeah, because it actually puts him into an interesting age window in terms of women, because he can go older or younger to quite a large degree. I think, and I mean actually from the perspective of his missions, not specifically where, hey, look what women he can get.
Yeah.
I mean that when he encounters women in the course of his mission and getting intimate with them would be of use to the mission, a James Bond almost has a larger window of women to work with because of the age gap, the age he falls into.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. This two back-to-back film thing won't go away as a rumour. I kind of wish it would, unless we're all wrong and they want to confirm it. But I've never really wanted to read young Bond novels or prequel novels or anything like that. We don't need to know what Bond was up to when he was 15, 18, 21. Beyond anything they choose to sort of drop in dialogue. If they want to drop in dialogue, you went through this in the Navy or whatever, then fine. But the whole point of Bond is he's been around and been through it and seen and done things. And that was true in Casino Royale as any other film, because newly minted 00 but veteran agent.
And that's why Cavill didn't get it. Because Cavill was down to the last two, wasn't he? Henry Cavill.
Yes, he was.
Good old Superman.
He was 22 at the point where they were screen testing. It's too young.
Yeah. I would have been too young even for, back a generation ago when the age thing was more fluid, when you had...
when there were people married with 2 kids at that age routinely.
So
it's not something I'd want to see. If they put it in front of me, I'd watch it. I'm a Bond fan and I would give it the benefit of the doubt. But I think people have forgotten, because I was having a debate with someone online not very long ago, and they were trying to say that C was the head of MI6, Inspector, and I said, no, C is the head of MI5. And they said, no, C is the head of... And they started pulling out stuff from the real world to show me, and I said, yes, that's the real world. M is the head of MI6.
Yeah.
And it gets forgotten because there's so much talk in the last couple of films about the 00 section that we think the 00 section is the only bit M manages. The 00 section is part of MI6. Judi Dench was his boss before she made him a 00. In fact, she promoted him to a 00.
Yeah.
So in that universe, Andrew Scott's character was C, but C was the head of MI5, which is deals with domestic terrorism and domestic threats, whereas MI6 is worldwide. They were going to merge it into one security service.
Yeah, which as a premise is, on the one hand, if you think about it, incredibly dull, but on the other hand, actually incredibly pertinent. They could have done so much more with that, and they could have had so much more fun with it. Because the whole point of I think, a good Bond film, not that one can find the magic formula, but for me, the ones that work, and work very well, no matter how fantastical they go, or how grounded in some sort of nominal reality they stay, is that they take a premise that's pertinent at the time, something that could happen, or is a feature even of day-to-day, even quite drab reality, and they turn that on its head and they just amp it up and amp it up and amp it up with a logical continuity. So if there had been maybe more of a MacGuffin or something that was rooted in that quest for somebody to merge the services, and equally more of an indication of the threat that would pose if that happened. What happens if you lose?
We live in a world now where the merging of those two services wouldn't shock us.
Yeah.
Austerity.
Would it save money?
Else.
Would it actually save money?
I've no idea, but you can present it in the basis. In a 2-hour film, you can present that as something that would happen in Britain today.
I mean, there's an incredible amount of... I mean, I talk about... It's a bizarre thing, but for me, and I have no idea why this is, we'll move from Bond in a second, but the idea that they had to really elongate something that could have been told a lot more sleekly. So things like the idea of them erecting the C-section building and having the old MI6 building scheduled for demolition. Now, that's a credible fantasy, and I'm talking about credible fantasy earlier on, but for some reason, for whatever reason, logically, to me, I just didn't buy that in a way that, for some reason, and it's a bizarre reason, all to do with execution, I can actually switch off and say, do you know what, I accept lasers in space. And it's exactly the same thing with Die Another Day. If you think logically, obviously there are huge holes and huge problems with that. But in terms of, I suppose, the general coherence, I can accept North Korea as a threat, as we all can at the moment. I can accept the beginning bit. But just the going from that...
The most fantastical part of that film was not the North Korean threat, or the fact that there was an invisible car, or the fact that a 40-something Brosnan could bang a 23-year-old Rosamund Pike. I think the most far-fetched bit of that film, that a guy could turn white, form an empire, create a new...
That's what I mean.
And be knighted in 14 months.
Yeah, I know this is a bit like metatextual, and you're going to hate this word, but this word that a lot of film directors use, which is verisimilitude, which is that even if you have a fantastical dimension to something, be it realism or fantasy, ultimately a film, by its very nature, no matter how dark and gritty or realistic you go, or fantastical, has to have an inner logic to it, and a continuity, and the bits have to feel like they merge into each other, just seamlessly. And I think the difficulty with Spectre, in a way that I don't have with Moonraker, and the difficulty to some extent also with Die Another Day that I don't have with, say, a Moonraker or a Spy Love Me, is that you're actually looking at two different scripts being welded together. So that in Die Another Day, by the time you get to the Ice Palace and the changing faces and all that sort of rubbish, you've seen a different movie and you're pissed off that you didn't actually get the fulfillment of that. Okay, Bond's on the outside, how does he rebuild his life? Which you do get with Skyfall, to kind of make up for that. The idea that the Craig era is to some extent the Brosnan era done right. And in Spectre, you've got this politics story, which they could have taken that quite drab, almost soap operatic sort of BBC civil service drama side to it, and made that a slightly more exotic reality. But for some reason, because you've got this alternative storyline going on with Blofeld, and the two bits don't cohere, by the time you get to looking at the demolition of a building that in reality is still out there, when they haven't relocated, it just doesn't work.
The same debate.
Yeah.
There was the very same debate when we were arguing over C and M and MI6 and everything else.
Yeah.
Somebody said something about that new building.
Yeah.
And I said, no, that was CG. They're still in the... Because that was the MI5 building, but that was going to be the new joint headquarters.
And there was no need for it. I just said, no,
that, to my knowledge, doesn't exist. That's CG. They're still in Vauxhall Cross or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
They said, but we saw it. And I said, no, what you saw was a model with CG and, you know.
So it just didn't, you know.
Still there.
Yeah. And if that were the whole, like, if the whole movie had built up to that, if that were the fantasy set piece, if you like, if that were our equivalent of the space lasers, and that building had some significance, if they showed us how this Nine Eyes program worked or whatever, that would have worked coherently. But because literally you're looking at a script that was kind of put together from odds and ends and had so many competing features to it, but it was disappointing because Skyfall had managed to effectively make exactly the same point, but far more succinctly. It was a little bit Chris Nolan, a little bit overlabored, you know, the speech from M quoting Tennyson, which another Morse connection was used very skillfully in a Morse episode, by the way, but anyway. But
had a pint of bitter and drove around in a Jaguar.
Well, he did manage to drive her all the way up to Scotland. Yeah, what they did for 10 hours, obviously there was a cutscene. It's filthy. Yeah, it's just we will not have filth, yeah, on this. Well, he fingered her in a conspiracy. He exposed the fact that exactly. That's how it works. But that does mean that the challenge, therefore, to some extent, certainly from my perspective, as a fan not just of Bond, but of good cinema, which is what the Daniel Craig era has pushed Bond into at least aiming to be consistently, even if they fall short of the mark a couple of times, is that his send-off, his swan song, which may even be the title, I don't know, has to offer something in the way of some sort of closure on his era and his tenure, without that being a thing, in inverted commas, which kills the verisimilitude, sorry for the word, of the piece by being either too laboured and pretentious or stuck on as a coda that you don't need. And the only way I can think of doing that is to actually employ that technique you mentioned from Fleming, which is to end, literally, on a cliffhanger, not with his death, but with something that looks like he's maybe facing that. So the idea is that his era doesn't actually finish. We don't actually give him death or retirement or pipe and slippers. We don't make the mistake of Spectre sort of trying to give him a cafe in Florence, which never suited him, but something.
But the next film feels like a rebirth as a result.
Yeah, and you always leave it as one of those fanboy questions, that what actually happened afterwards or something. And the way, because everyone's saying, oh, can they just ignore the Christoph Waltz and Lea Seydoux thing? I'm increasingly the view that no, they can't, because they made such a big deal of bringing those people in.
Too many people have said, I've seen people say, well, hang on a minute, in the Craig universe, him driving away in the car is no different from Brosnan or Moore finishing in bed with a woman.
Except they did try and make a big deal of that.
But no, it isn't. It isn't the same. The whole film was about, can you make a life for yourself and everything. That is representative of the character making a big decision at the end of the film, not we've got a bit of time to kill before the next mission.
Yeah. But so here's
I think you could, but I think it would be a shock and it would lead to people asking, well, what happened to her? In the way that it wouldn't when you got to Moonraker in Triple X, wasn't there?
Do you bring back Waltz?
I don't know, is the honest answer. He could be in custody in this film.
A little Hannibal Lecter job, he goes to him maybe for some advice even. To deal with a Goldfinger or a Drax or whoever.
If you keep bringing back Blofeld as the main antagonist each time out,
you're
going to have to make a decision about him that the original series never had to make. They've blown their wad in the first film. I genuinely think the problem is that, and I said this on a Do You Expect Us to Talk, the mistake they make is that the main antagonist isn't Blofeld, the main antagonist is Spectre.
Yeah.
When you look at the Connery era, Blofeld was just this sort of hidden figure that we saw, a hand and a cat occasionally, heard a voice occasionally, and it built to like a reveal on him.
Yeah.
And then in the next film we saw him again, and then in the next film we saw him again, and then thereafter in the Moore era, with all the issues around Kevin McClory and everything else, it went away. We've never had to see what he would have done with Blofeld and Spectre had it gone on for 25 years. Or effectively it was open-ended, that they would have to make a decision, right, what do we do with these villains? I think you've made a big mistake showing Blofeld in the first film, all of him, instead of it just this vague presence.
Yeah. And
instead of building to it over a number of films, you've done the Big Bang in film 1, you now want to bring him back. What is the end game? Because if you're postulating that he's effectively the Joker in this universe to Bond, as Joker is to Batman, he is to Bond, then you don't actually want to kill him off. You want him available to come back in different guises and all that in the future.
Yeah.
Well, if you bring him back in the last film of the Craig era, and I'm not sure it's avoidable, but if you do bring him back, we're going to be looking for closure on it.
Yeah. But that's the real problem, is that they were giving closure to something that hadn't even been opened. That's why that bloody retcon thing was possibly that was, you know, I talk about verisimilitude. I can buy lasers in space. I can buy an invisible car. I didn't buy the idea.
Bond gave him the scar, and
Yeah.
you know, and he took Vesper from him. I mean, I talked about it during the Spectre, one of the Spectre episodes we did, where I went on this whole riff about how Blofeld would have planned the events of Casino Royale. And if you actually think about it logically, it would hang on so much luck and ridiculous foresight. It's untrue.
Yeah.
Because if Quantum, as we came to know it, had blown up that plane in Miami, there wouldn't have been a card game.
No. But then there's, I mean, the other thing, there was a debate about this on James Bond Radio. I think they even referenced it in one of their episodes. And was it Chris and who's the other guy? Tom, yeah. And they're great ambassadors for Bond fandom because they're outstandingly normal, kind of sporty, sort of virile guys. You know, they're not.
Tuned in for.
Yeah. Try James Bond Radio's girlfriend. But they did say this. I said, look, we're going to get pissed off with this. Spectre was not founded to piss off James Bond, and it doesn't mean that all of Bond's missions were a product of Blofeld's grudge. Well, narratively, kind of, it does look that way, unless, and this is where I think they have actually created an opportunity from adversity storytelling-wise. What if the kind of MacGuffin, so to speak, in the next one, is actually almost Bond's mental health, for want of a better time, where he's sort of thinking, well, is this? It can't have been that way. You know, it can't be that this foster brother set this all up and so on. And it turns out that maybe Spectre is a much bigger picture. That the name Blofeld even is almost like Mandarin. It's passed around.
Because you've seen the cat and the scar now.
Sure, but they could still keep those. And the other thing is, if we're being really literal about this, James Bond, if we go all the way back to Fleming, is very much a product of a schoolboy rivalry. Blofeld is even named after someone he was at school with. Not because he hates him, but he just picked the name Blofeld.
The cricket commentator.
Yeah, precisely. So they could even work that into it a bit, in the sense that, you know, if we look at Facebook and stuff like that, occasionally one gets a friend request from maybe somebody who was at school with you or whatever, and they're either an obscure contact or they were a welcome friend, or worse still, it's somebody who bullied the hell out of you, or who maybe even you bullied or disliked or whatever. And you kind of think, well, okay, time moves on and people change, but equally, why the bloody hell would you want to connect with me now, 25 years later, whatever it is, unless you're bearing a grudge? You know?
I've had a few of those, one or two people that I thought you were a horrible human being.
Yeah, and people don't change that much. I mean, they modify. But if you were a psychopath in your school days, the chances are, you know, unless you've had a radical baptism of fire change.
I wouldn't want to rule out change, but
so,
people who I struggled with at 14,
yeah,
I'm not desperate to reconnect with 25 years later.
No, because there's no sentimental
desire.
desire.
Any better. It's that they don't come with any warm and fuzzy memories.
And even the ones that do come with warm and fuzzy memories, to be honest, I don't think I'd want to connect with. I mean, not now, anyway.
No,
Certainly
I mean,
a lot of,
I've got some school friends on there and a few and all the rest of it, but
it's
I don't
sad.
really fucking like school, so I don't care.
Yeah, but the passage of time and so on. But what I'm saying is that it is not. Bearing in mind, if we go back to the premise of Bond being simply an exaggeration of, or a magnification of reality, you're taking a kind of a family feud or a schoolboy jealousy that could, in reality, be connected to geopolitics, but that's not the same as saying that that character in universe created all of the things. And I think the best way out of that, frankly, is to expose Oberhauser as some sort of Walter Mitty. Yes, he was a member of this Spectre thing, but no, he did not have quite the power he was claiming. That then leaves the gigantic gap of where did he get the script, so to speak, about Bond to that extent? Why was he playing mind games with him to that extent? And the only thing that I can think of as a worthy way to spin it is to, yes, have that subplot going on about retconning the retcon, if you like, because I do think that has to be done as a fan, if nothing else, because I liked the previous films. But the second thing is, I think you could perfectly well have a self-contained mission. Carte Blanche does this very well, by the way, the book. Did you read that? You know, the continuation novel by Geoffrey Diver.
So I haven't read many continuations,
but that one's a very good one, I think. But it
does.
does a very good job of having a self-contained mission, but having a subplot where Bond is just exploring something at a personal level. And it turns out there's a revelation about his family at the end. but that's not the key to the mission. So they could very well have Daniel Craig's Bond in his final mission, a self-contained thing where he's on the trail of a Drax or a latter-day Goldfinger or whatever it is. But the final kind of twist is that he discovers some additional layer to the background thing from Spectre. And okay, you don't have Leia Seydoux as the main girl, but maybe you have her very slightly hinted at the beginning, and maybe he has a little reunion with her at the end, not because they're married, and maybe, just maybe, and this could be total fan fiction crap, but remember we talked about The World Is Not Enough and how it comes so close to being excellent until they sort of cut off. Well, the pitch for The World Is Not Enough was from Barbara Broccoli, and she said, imagine if he thinks he's met Tracy, but in fact he's met Blofeld. And they referenced Blofeld quite... It was before they got the rights, obviously, or it was the same year, I think, but the idea being that... No, it was the year they got the rights to Casino Royale, 99. They didn't have Blofeld, but she has cut off her earlobe, which is the feature of the de Beauchamps, which is I think, in the French for Blofeld.
The Beauchamps is the cover he's using in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and when you watch On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Telly Savalas in it has no earlobes, and it's something he's done to further his claim to be part of his ancestry.
Sure. So if, and hear me out, I know you're going to hate this, but this is just something I was thinking. You have this self-contained mission, which is not bogged down in all the shit from Spectre. But just for the sake of the fans, to appease them, you have Bond, in his downtime or whatever, subtly explore, with some select cameos from Waltz, and thereby undo some of the shit that was in Spectre while still keeping it canon. And then at the end, having had several affairs during the film, which have nothing to do with Leia Seydoux, he simply goes back to her because she's in town, fancy a coffee, that sort of thing, the James Bond equivalent of that. Maybe there's a hotel suite or something like that. And there's just something akin to something on a coffee table or whatever it is that's just a split second that indicates that maybe the name Blofeld and maybe the psychological mind game that was set up for him. Bearing in mind she's a psychologist, bearing in mind she had a reason to have a grudge against him because he basically toppled Mr. White's quantum organization.
I was going to say, she's the daughter of the...
And she's a good actress who can do evil and vicious in a split second. There were moments in Spectre where she's so close to doing that, but she hasn't quite got the script to propel her into it. She gives a look that sort of says, do you know what? I don't fucking love you, you're pathetic. And then she's all over in the next minute.
It's more a case of that they always say Bond films are set in the year they're released.
Yeah.
In which case, Spectre was released. I think the only slight retcon on that is Casino Royale and Quantum.
Yeah.
Because they're 2 years apart and the story's on.
Yeah.
So it's a shift in timeline, but when you sit and watch the original film, Die Another Day is set in 2002.
Yes.
Okay? If we were still in that timeline, it wouldn't be 15 years ago now, but at the time it was, if that makes any sense at all.
Yes.
Now, that suggests that it's going to be set 4 years after Spectre.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for someone of Bond's background in Damage, to make a relationship last 4 years would be quite an achievement.
Yeah, but then it doesn't have to... I mean, there are girlfriends. I mean, I'm not no reflection on you or me. I'm not going into people's personal lives. But hypothetically speaking, I'm not talking about me, but maybe hinting in that direction. There are certain girlfriends who leave a huge impact, and you have a relationship at a certain time in your life. You're bonded by circumstance, whatever. Those circumstances finish, and you just have to accept, look, this isn't going to be sustainable because we're going to be in different parts of the world, whatever it is. But you stay in touch via WhatsApp or text or whatever Bond's equivalent of that is, and maybe you meet up, a year later if she happens to be in London. And as I'm saying, we talked about Gala Brand as well in Moonraker, where she just sort of shrugs her shoulders at the end and says, sorry, James, I've got someone else. At the end of this self-contained mission, and with the subtext of he discovers he thinks he's discovered what was behind the Spectre and the Blofeld thing, and kind of uncovered some of the retconning stuff. There's just a meeting with Leia Seydoux, and there's just a hint that could be that could
almost to leave it alone. In that you can, I don't mean necessarily leave Spectre alone because I can't see them doing that.
No.
They've obviously got to do something about Leia. But in terms of retconning I am the author of all
retcon the retcon.
I don't know that you can actually. I think you'd be wise to leave that alone and just almost delete it from your own personal canon. That Spectre was there doing something all along, but let's not assume they set up the game in Montenegro.
Yeah.
Let's not assume they killed Vesper. Let that bit go.
Yeah, and Blofeld perhaps exaggerated because that's what villains do. But you could have a From Russia with Love ending, I think, in the sense that you could just end very slightly on a cliffhanger. Just a look to camera, something that indicates that Daniel Craig's James Bond does not simply go off into the sunset. He doesn't retire. He's not killed in action, but he doesn't end on a damp squib either. There is a hint that this man is about to walk into more mortal peril, but you somehow end that in a kind of a way that's upbeat but also provocative, which always leaves a slight question mark over it. That's what I'm talking about. Just sort of something that indicates, and I just think maybe if you're hinting at he's found a happy ending, not that sort of happy ending, or maybe in both senses, but it isn't quite the happy ending that he something. I just think there's potential to do it in such a way that it's not as cliched as trying to copy Cafe in Florence, but it's not as happily ever after in Pipe and Slippers, because that really doesn't suit this iteration of the character either. But equally, it's not going to leave you depressed.
I'm looking forward to you crowbarring Cafe in Florence into our postman Pat show.
Yes,
because you managed to get that in everywhere.
It's my thing. It's my thing. It's my when I mentioned these girls who I occasionally have the privilege of being able to meet up with years later. Cafe in Florence is always sort of it turns out to be a cafe sort of outside Waterloo or something, or a cafe in Birmingham. But the principle is very much the same. A lovely little Cafe in Florence moment. Now, one franchise in which I cannot crowbar Cafe in Florence into by any stretch of the imagination, so all references now deleted, is, of course, the thing that I got you here in the first place. Under false pretenses, because we've taken so long to not talk about it, but Terminator. Have you seen the 3D refit of Terminator 2?
No.
Jim?
I didn't see any point. I'm not a 3D hater, particularly, nor am I... Well, just a quick word on 3D, really. I think 3D is one of the most missold tools ever. Because when you look at a cinema chain who want you to buy a 3D ticket, they'll sell it on the basis of a wow factor. There's nothing wow about 3D. I see. If that was the case, 98% of my life would be desperately exciting because it's all in 3D. I think that what 3D does is just that extra layer of absorption sometimes. Just a little bit more physical depth in it, and I've enjoyed 3D a few times, but actually, it's not poor if you almost forget you're watching it. That doesn't make it bad. It just means you've been absorbed into it. And his 3D conversion of Titanic was very well done. And he did switch it back to a 178 to 1 ratio as well. So he sort of unmatted some of it. I've got no doubt it would look fine. I just didn't hugely see the point. That's not to say I don't get this restoration in 4K at some point. It's not because it's 3D. It's because I've had to go out on a weeknight when I was probably doing something else. I was probably recording Smorgasbord or something. And pay a lot more money to sit and watch a film I know extremely well with an extra dimension. And I wasn't that bothered. Had it been The Terminator, I might have done, because I've never seen it on the big screen. And I think that's the superior film. But to go and see a film that I have a healthy dose of respect for with reservations, I don't know that I was up for it. It's not that special a film to me.
Yeah. Well,
and that's kind of the way I've always been with it. Did you go see it?
No. Well, I haven't yet. But I'm lucky enough to have. There are quite a few small cinemas that are doing sort of special evenings and that sort of thing. So I might go to a themed event, dress up in a leather jacket, put on a pair of shades. No, not quite. But I'm attracted to it because it's Cameron behind the conversion. I have to say, I have taken to just avoiding 3D versions of any film at the moment because I can take off my 3D specs and I can kind of watch the film even though it's nominally in 3D. There have been a few standout moments where I've seen the 3D really work. I remember Captain America's shield flying out. The Captain America conversion was pretty good. The Thor's was absolutely appalling.
I saw the Captain America one.
Yeah.
I think I may have even had a 3D disc of it at home.
Wow.
Most of them, you look at something like Iron Man 3.
Yeah.
There's a whole action sequence in it in which the 3D is excellent. The rest of the film they just didn't really bother with.
Yeah.
Marvel's conversions are not that great.
No.
They're more underwhelming than they're bad.
Yeah.
Although Guardians was the only 3D film in that series that I'd seen to that point. I saw a lot of Phase 1 and 2 in that format. That was the only one where I thought that had something because it really gave a scale to space.
Yeah.
The bit where he stood talking to Gamora and they're looking out on an expanse. that plays well in 3D.
But I think you can
something when you don't. The same was true of Tron Legacy a few years ago.
Yeah, but I think to me, and I think a lot of people agree with me on this, unless it is specifically made in 3D, made for 3D, you don't go to a post-conversion job. There's just very little point.
That's less true these days.
Is it? Right?
Well, in general, when it first came along, and suddenly they saw Avatar and thought that must have done really well because it's in 3D, and then suddenly everything is 3D.
Yeah.
It looked like. I tell you what, I mean, I don't know if you've had the same experiences, and this may not hit any touchstone with people, but you'd go and see a 3D film, and you'd be watching sort of adverts at the start of the film, and it would say, throw on 3D specs now. And you'd see an advert for, I don't know, fucking Zanussi or something, but or something, but it would be a 3D advert, but it was a conversion, and what it would always look like were like layers of 2D, in that there would be something in the foreground and something in the background. And they would clearly be on different planes from each other, but in and of themselves they looked really flat. In that this post-conversion software was awful. I remember Clash of the Titans being one of the most slaughtered for it. It had matured by the time Star Trek Into Darkness came along, because that was a post-conversion and the 3D was excellent, as I recall. But it got to a point where I'd go with a friend and we'd see a film in 3D, and he would just turn to me and say, "What's the point?" And I'm thinking, well, I'm not in love with it enough to bother if he doesn't want to. So I really stopped going to see them in 3D. But beyond the first few reactionary months of it's a gimmick and slaughtering it like an old man, I did come to appreciate it over time. But it's never been a must-have. I'm about to move house, and in the finances of doing all that, I'll buy a UHD TV, I'll get 4K, and most of them don't have 3D in them, and I don't feel like I'm losing anything with that.
Yeah. But then even if the conversion were perfect, one of the things you've hinted at is the idea that although it's a beloved film, people are quite sentimental about it, Terminator 2 is the inferior to the first.
I would say we're probably in a minority on that, James, but I've never felt any different. I mean, a little bit of background on it from me. I first saw it on, there was a BBC Two sort of film show presented by, or like a film presentation presented by Alex Cox in the 80s called Movie Drone.
Yes.
And on a given week in, I don't know, 1987, 88, somewhere around there, the film presented that night was The Terminator. And what he would do is talk about it for a few minutes first, its importance. You'd get the odd shot from the film, and he'd talk about approach and how it was typical of a film of its time or not. I remember him pointing out the sort of walk and talks through the police department, where like Captain Terrell, whatever is the actor's called, Paul Winfield, was talking to like one of his staff as they were walking through and smoking and coffee, and he was saying how typical that was of a film of its era. So anyway, I saw The Terminator in, I always thought it was earlier than this, but it could well have been sort of 88, something like that. So unless it was very late in the year, I'd have been about 11 probably. And I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And then I heard they were making another one with Arnie as the good guy. And even as a child, I thought that was the stupidest fucking idea ever. But okay, that's fair enough. And I was sat at home on the morning after it was released, assuming it came out on a Friday. I was at home on a Saturday morning, and there was a TV spot for it. So a series of commercial breaks, and then like a short 15 to 30 seconds of Terminator 2. And the shot was the T-1000 headbutting the door of the helicopter and then pouring in and reforming.
Yeah.
And I was at the next showing of that film. Having seen that advert, I was at the next showing of that film. We were pre-internet, so I had to queue for it. I was a couple of months short of 15, but I looked old enough, so that was fine. And I went and saw it then. And I have to say, the first time I was really impressed because it upscaled what we'd seen first so well in terms of scale of filmmaking, scale of budget. And Arnie playing the good guy, actually, Terminator, it kind of worked in that it's not about being a good or bad guy, it's just about your programming. He's just been grabbed and reprogrammed to protect him. You know, he would have killed anyone who came near John Connor if John Connor had stopped him from doing so. Hadn't stopped him from doing so. As years have followed, I just don't enjoy it as much as the first one. It's strangely dated. I talked about this when we did Rocky 5. When we did that podcast, I talked about how sort of 1989 to 91 is like a micro era all of its own, in that he's wearing a Public Enemy t-shirt and listening to Guns N' Roses. But it's meant to be 1994, a fact most people miss. But Connor is born in 84. The universe progresses in real time, and he's listed as 10 years old with a date of birth of 1984 when the policeman, when the T-1000 is looking at the computer. So it arrived predated. Even Arnie's haircut, which is so similar to subsequent appearances he's made in the series, is just cut in that early 90s way. So the film is strangely dated. It lacks the threat of the original one. It lacks the atmosphere of the original one. It lacks the self-doubt of the original one. I mean, the original one, everyone thinks Kyle and Linda Hamilton's character, Sarah, is crazy. Most of all, on top of all of that, I think there was a layer of lazy moralising in the film. You know, if we can learn the value of life, he can learn the value of life.
Yeah.
Two other things just to say. Edward Furlong nearly ruins the film for me. I find it almost unwatchable now because of him. That whiny voice and stupid hair. I can't stand the little bastard. And I just wish, again, a bit like, go older or go younger, do something.
Or don't go there.
Try and protect him as a kid, or let's have him as an older teenager.
Yeah.
So I don't like Edward Furlong in it. He looked an obnoxious kid, and the actor grew into an obnoxious adult, and I'm not remotely surprised. So that's a problem with the film. It's dated in its way. The CG still looks really good for its era. Obviously, we can do better now, but it still looks pretty good. The T1, but I think my final point on the film, before we sort of get into a two-way conversation of it, was there's no ideal cut of that film, unfortunately, because there's a couple of deleted scenes that explain things in the film. But if you watch the full cut, it's too long and baggy, as director's cuts almost always are, and James Cameron ones really are. I mean, I loved. There's a deleted scene which I don't know if did go into the director's cut. It might have done, but the T-1000 is in John's room, and he's touching everything, and it's like it is because he needs to almost commune with things to be able to turn into them. And
interesting.
And there's a sensual element to him as well.
That's more of the kind of the horror stuff from the first one.
But I like it.
Yeah.
It's only the one scene. But the other thing is, there's a scene in the actual final cut of the film where Arnie picks up a gun, I think it might be like a Gatling gun type thing, and he looks at John and pulls a smirk.
Yeah.
And it took me right out of the film, even at 15. I looked at it and went, oh, that's fucking stupid. He wouldn't do that. Now, of course, in the extended cut, we have that bit where they basically take out his inhibitor so he can learn. And that's where he gets taught how to smile and all the rest of it. But that cut's really baggy. So the cut we're left with has bits that are explained by the longer cut and actually play really badly without those bits of explanation. And then you've got Linda Hamilton, who had such a journey in the first film. And in this one, she sat there in like a fucking wife beater with a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. And I just think, oh, this is just every cliche of strong women. And for Hollywood version of strong women, in that, you know, Cameron came out the other day banging on about Wonder Woman and how regressive it is. And I'm thinking, well, she's no more cliched than your Sarah Connor was.
I mean, look, the reality is, you know, he is, whatever way one looks at it, a remarkable man. And this comes in a week where there's been all this debate about, you know, what is it to be a man and so on. And that's giving me a pain in the arse, frankly, because I think the fact is one has to be able, in today's world, a more emotionally literate world, to acknowledge that we are vulnerable, that we're not all Supermen and we don't have incredible power. But at the same time, to be able to take a step back and look at a guy like James Cameron and say, yeah, you know, when we hear something like Man Up, that is a guy who has bloody well made epic films. He's dived in submarines and whatnot.
I've got an enormous amount of respect
for him. But what he's not, and I think I'd even say this to his face, well, I probably wouldn't say it to his face, I wouldn't get the chance, but he's not an intellectual. He thinks he is, but he doesn't actually have particularly innovative, creative, literary story ideas. And when he talks about those sides of things, and this is why I despair at the idea that he's now making 4 Avatar films when he's been pushed to even come up with a story for 1. He really, he's not a well of storytelling. He's somebody who is a technological innovator. He's somebody who is an immensely gifted filmmaker. But what he is not, I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, is somebody who comes up with an original, literate, beginning, middle, and end story.
No, I mean, he had to pay royalties for the first Terminator film.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that happened by accident. That's a little.
By accident,
that's a little bit like the George Harrison thing with "Oh My Sweet Lord," where he had to pay royalties because he'd accidentally plagiarized to a certain extent.
I mean, but even Cameron's better films have flaws that you have to accept if you're going to understand him. Now, Avatar's a strange experience for me because I hated it on first and second viewings. And over the years, I've come to become quite fond of it. And I quite enjoy being in the world now. And I do ascribe that partly to 3D. There's an immersion to it in some respects. But it's just the way it acts on your brain, I think.
You can look at it without watching it. That's the appeal to that film. I have replayed that film again and again. And on no occasion am I watching it. But it is a part of my life. It's a part of my library in the sense that if I am feeling on a particular night like I need a break, but not a complete break, I need to have something in the background.
The soundscape of it's pleasant.
It's beautiful. It's like a flotation tank. It's the equivalent of an athlete's flotation tank on screen. You can immerse yourself in that world and look at it. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, only James Cameron could think Sam Worthington was ideal for that role. Because he kind of looks the part, and when I look at apologies for those of you, I think I've got listeners certainly called with this first name, but Kyle Reese is the sort of thing that somebody who's not in the military would call an American military guy, I think.
Yeah.
It's a strange kind of thing. And even Aliens, I mean, Cameron himself regrets this to this day because his brother was a Marine, so I don't think he's got disrespect for the Marine Corps, but he painted them as a bunch of fucking lunkheads.
That's the thing, yeah. And I think that's just...
The characters are assholes.
But that's, once again, that's the problem, Dave, is the sense that he's just not a good enough writer to be able to convey that respect. I've got no doubt that he's got the respect. In fact, I think he's what I call a bit of a military wannabe. These guys who revere the military to the extent because they haven't...
A lot of his main characters are military.
Yeah, and he says things like, when there was a rumour, and I don't know whether this was validated, vindicated, whatever it was, but it went around that on Titanic, Kate Winslet nearly drowned or something.
Yes.
And his response to that was, yeah, stuff like that can happen on film sets, but I'll tell you what, not on my watch. I kind of, oh dear, you're one of these corporate guys who talk about, take one for the team and stuff like that. But I think he's mellowed a bit. He's certainly a more articulate guy. But as I say, he will never be quite a literary, cinematic storyteller. And I don't think he has quite the kind of the kind of panoramic intellect to draw on the things in the way that he wants to. But that is why I think Terminator 1 is a one and done, because it's a self-contained action thriller. It doesn't need a gigantic universe of other spin-offs or possibilities, and I don't think it was initially designed that way. It's why Aliens, by its very nature, is the ultimate sequel, which to some extent finishes the Alien franchise. There is nowhere to go except down after that, and he himself was very disappointed with what they did with Alien 3. And for all of his machismo, and for all of the kind of the bullets and all the rest of it, I think he's at heart quite a sentimental character who likes happy endings.
It doesn't surprise me that there's often a love story in there somewhere.
Yeah, he likes to. He's one of these guys who probably, when he's romancing a woman, I mean, I don't want to speak for Cameron's private life, but I can picture he's one of those guys who probably buys flowers, makes a compilation CD, books like the most expensive restaurant, probably polishes his shoes.
Well, he's quite a romantic. I mean, he's got married 4 or 5 times. So
that's pretty romantic, I guess.
He's really romantic.
Yeah. But he's...
So I think over the years, and it's something I've learned through adulthood, is to accept the bad with the good with Cameron.
Yeah.
In that when I watched Titanic, I was fucking horrified. You know what I mean? I really was. And it wasn't just that I was like 20 or whatever I was when it came out. It was purely that, I thought that the dialogue was awful.
Yep.
The grandstanding, the speeches, just all of it was terrible beyond the visual level. And even at a visual level, he tried to push the envelope a little bit further than it would go with CG at that stage.
Yeah.
So a lot of the sort of move past of the ship didn't look right. And then I got to see Avatar, which, you know, everyone said about Fern Gully and Dancing with Wolves and all the rest of it. And all of that is true, but most things are borrowed from somewhere. The main problem I had with the film was that I don't think a true actor's director would have cast Sam Worthington and ended up with that performance. He was a void at the centre of that film.
Yeah.
That film is carried by Zoe Saldana.
That's right.
But as years have gone by, I've learned to try to appreciate him for what he is rather than what he isn't.
I mean, I would certainly love to have seen what he would have done with.
And cinema is in a stronger place technologically for his existence.
Yeah, and he changed. He was a proper game changer. And I would have loved to have seen what he would have done with Spider-Man had the rights been in place at the time.
I did read the script to it. It wasn't. I didn't like the sound of it, to be honest. I have to say. But
I can imagine watching that in the mid-90s and thinking, wow. You know, it just feels like the 90s film that didn't happen. There's something so 90s about that. A James Cameron
style. If you want someone to grab something, and if you want something on the screen that technology isn't really ready for, hand it to him and he'll make it happen.
Yeah.
Because we weren't ready for the T-1000.
Nope.
Then we really weren't. And we weren't really ready for photorealistic, you know, full performances that look live action in Avatar. You know, there was more than Lucas. Lucas has pushed on digital, and he's a great champion of new technologies. But he's really put it up on screen at times when it isn't ready and doesn't look ready. Cameron finds a way to make it work. There's very little in his films that ever looks really bad. And Terminator 2, from a cultural perspective, is aging quite badly, but from a technology perspective, it's aging very well.
Sure. I mean, look, as I say, my problem with Terminator 2 is simply that it lags about halfway through. The thriller element is gone, and it's gone actually for me quite rapidly. Once they reprogram the already reprogrammed Arnie, it kind of loses that element of tension.
They don't reprogram him in the theatrical version.
No, but this is where we.
I know where in the film you mean.
Yeah, but there's just no beating. On the other hand, certain shots of him, the coolness of before you know that he's a good guy. That moment where he walks through the mall with the box with the roses, and he has the gun, yeah, and he has the shades and everything. And it's funny, an actor I always think about, and we've talked about him before, and he's very underrated. You know, Robert Davi.
Yes.
Well, he is very good friends with Arnold.
Robert Davi.
Personally, he listens to your podcast. He did actually share a couple of my reviews once, so he's a nice guy. He's aware of it. But the idea is that he and Arnie were actually quite good mates.
Of what? My podcast or films?
I don't know. He's certainly seen a couple of my reviews, and he's he's a very busy man.
We always joke about him listening to us, but
it's not impossible. But he was good friends with Arnold because they made, I think it was it Raw Deal together, and they were regularly at parties together in London with people like Michael Winner. And what Robert has said is that Arnold and him talk to some extent, they sort of swapped notes. So Arnie would give him sort of the workout ideas, and Robert Davi gave Arnold certain ideas about gesture. And if you look at the way that they hold a cigar, for example, and deliver a quip, there's a moment in License to Kill where Robert Davi does that. And for a split second, you look at it and it could be Arnold.
I've instantly pictured where you mean, and I've never thought about it before, but I've zoned in on what you're trying to say instantly.
Yeah, and in exactly the same way, there are moments in Terminator where I can almost see. This is why I believe everything that Robert Davi says about it. Because usually if an actor says that kind of thing, you say, mate, you're riffing, this is bullshit. But because Robert Davi is so honest for a start, he can't be anything but, to the extent that he doesn't care if people know that he supports Trump or whatever, he just gets on with it. But his story about Arnold just rings true, because there are a couple of shots in Terminator 2, his movement and that of Robert, in the same way of trying to convey in a split second you're the villain, but you could also have this slightly heroic underpin, or you could reverse that. Because there are moments where Sanchez, as a Bond villain, is almost quasi-sympathetic. And what's interesting is that he actually
he sits sort of at his mansion house with Tim.
Yeah. He's almost like, it's like Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart meeting Laurence Olivier.
Entirely reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, okay, yes, he is a vicious bastard, but there are moments where you kind of think, actually, that the truly dark character in that, okay, yes, Sanchez is the guy who's had, sharks eat someone's legs, or whatever, but the really dark character is actually Bond, who you're worried about, thinking, mate, you're proper psycho. You need help. Whereas Sanchez is just almost like that Terminator thing. This is what I've been bred to do. This is what I do. I'm a drug dealer. I will kill you viciously if you get in my way. Well, Arnie just gives this look a couple of times, which is pure. They don't actually give him a cigar in this one, but just that pure kind of, in a split second, I can either protect you or I can kill you. And for all of those people who say that Arnold is not a good actor, and okay, he's not a character actor, and he jokes about not being that, but he is a hell of a good situation actor in the sense that you believe him in certain action situations. Not as a white-collar action guy. I've never believed him as a detective or anything like that, but as simply that force of nature kind of, don't mess with me.
I do think he's limited, but at the same time, some of that is accent as well. Some of that is the fact that it's very difficult when it's not your first language. Even if you're thinking in that language, you don't express yourself in quite the same way.
But there's no one else who could have I think done what Cameron wanted. And I think True. Have you seen True Lies, for example?
It's one of the few I haven't seen. I
still
haven't seen True Lies.
It's not on Blu-ray. They haven't done a Blu-ray release of it yet.
No, they haven't.
And Cameron did his usual kind of, to some extent, bandwagon hopping, sort of mea culpa about, because it was, I think, just after 9/11 they'd been looking at a sequel, and as we talked about before, 9/11 changed very briefly for at least a year. If we look at the Jack Ryan thing again, how movies were made for a year. Do we make an action movie? Do we not go there? Do we make it funny and And he was kind of mea culpaing about having a film where Arab terrorists try and destroy an American city or whatever. But as a movie, once again, he gets certain things wrong. Like he tries to throw in a very detailed, deep subplot about a marriage, which doesn't work because it's actually in his bid to be very, I think, almost feminist in how he treats Jamie Lee Curtis. Ironically enough, it does the opposite. It comes across as a nasty, sexist, domestic abuse on screen.
Without even seeing the film, I know some of the iconography of the film, and I think you put that in to make her, to give the due to, like, she can't just be the woman at home. She is being kept out of the loop. That's not fair. She's got to be involved. But of course...
But she is basically the little woman at home, and she's punished for trying to not be the little woman at home. And there's this attempted speech where she tries to explain why she's cheating, and you want to be sympathetic to her, and then you're kind of thinking, why should I listen to this? Why should she have to explain herself like that? Okay, she's been duped by a Walter Mitty who's pretending to be a spy, and that in itself is comic. But the French movie that it was based on, La Totale, once again manages to just do that with a finesse that James Cameron, by his very nature, he just doesn't have. But the action, and Arnie's acting in that, and I this is where Terminator 2, and yes, we're going to get into them very shortly before we wrap up, some of the inferior sequels. It's about a certain look that he can do. Because, okay, yes, he's not Laurence Olivier. Okay, he's not a character actor. But his ability to use his physique to convey rage, either actual or repressed, is actually pretty damn good. And for me, the things that work best in both 1 and 2 of the Terminators is that physicality that no other actor, because they looked at other actors, Mel Gibson, O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson, of course, would have done some real method acting, probably.
Well, the whole point of O.J. Simpson was they didn't cast him because he wouldn't be believable as a killer.
Yeah.
He had a lot of crossover appeal. He was doing like Hertz adverts and things like that.
You look, up until whatever happened, he was likable.
No, I understand that.
But as in terms of sheer physicality, even OJ at his peak, because he was an amazing athlete
but
for all.
It depends what you're trying to cast as the Terminator, because the original conception of him was more like a Lance Hendrickson.
Yeah, and Lance, I think Lance was pretty pissed off about losing that, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. I mean, the whole point was he's there to infiltrate. You wouldn't, in reality, have Arnie.
Yeah.
But what I think that he did really well, the thing I noticed, because I was watching. He's a lot smaller in Terminator 2, mainly because he's well past the peak of his bodybuilding years, although he's still in great shape.
Yeah.
But I was watching him in the '84 film, and I was thinking, something's not. What am I noticing here? And it was two things. Firstly, his eyes would move before his head.
Yes.
When he sat in the car, looking around for them, his eyes would move, and then his head would follow where his eyes had just gone. And that was a detail he came up with by himself, which is terrific. The second thing was his eyebrows had been burnt off earlier in the film, so they had like a bit lump of makeup over it.
No, but his jawline is different. His whole facial structure has refined or something. I mean, he's a 44-year-old man in Terminator 2, so although he's older, he's arguably in a way kind of at his peak. In the same way as
possibly as a film star, in some respects, almost too big in the first one. But the first one is the one I love. But I mean, he always turned up and gave his best in all of them.
I mean, the first one is a good thriller. It's a slasher movie with with sci-fi rather than sort of
It's a slasher movie with ideas.
yeah. And it's the action and the tension and the even things like the soundtrack, just everything is pretty flawless. The second one, although beloved and brilliant and innovative and funny and tense for the beginning of it, lags. And the thing about it is that on the one hand, it's making a sequel which, by its very nature, invites more sequels, yet closes everything off, which makes any subsequent sequel completely redundant.
Well, that's where we're talking about, we've gone through talking about. I've recorded 2 podcasts today. I don't want to confuse them because I did talk about Alien Covenant earlier, but
yeah, no, we're nearly done. But if we go to the excrement, I mean the other ones.
About aliens in a minute, a minute ago. Sorry, I thought then that if people say where do you want to see the Alien series go, it's like, well, I can't stop it, but I wish it had stopped in 1986. I'd have pushed 92 because I actually don't dislike Alien 3. But it does kind of piss on Aliens a bit.
It's like watching Depression, Alien 3. If you're feeling really shit, watch Alien 3.
It's not, yes, absolutely. But the same is true of these. I think the debate comes where you would have wanted the guillotine to fall.
Well, the problem with Alien Covenant is that it's basically a man with a point to prove. It should be called Ridley Scott, Alien, I'm Not Dead Yet, I Haven't Retired Yet, even though I'm 80. That's the subtitle. It's him trying to reclaim.
Did you see The Martian?
Yeah. Alien, Ridley, I'm Not Dead Yet. I've got 5 more years of these, and I'm going to keep making them just to piss everyone off. But
I mean, the point is, without going into Alien Covenant, as I say, it's a series that has long outlived its usefulness, and I think Terminator is true. I know how Hollywood works, and I've embraced the sequel. I mean, if a retrospective show, which is what I do most of the time, is anything, it is celebrating the fact that you do get loads of installments. So I clearly don't have a problem with it. But there are some series that you think, I know the financial returns, but oh my god, this is just pissing on a corpse now.
Yeah.
And I do think that of Terminator.
But you talk about obsolescence. Was it just obsolete? I mean, after Terminator 2, there's nowhere to go with that universe. The story is finished.
I think the problem is, though, by the very fact that, the first one was like this little curio that was made for about $6 million or something like that. It certainly wasn't an expensive film.
Yep.
And it finishes on a complete note of, not ambiguity, because we do know the nuclear war's coming.
Yeah.
But we don't quite know what shape or when or quite how it will kick off. So she's driving towards a storm, because Cameron is nothing if not subtle.
Yeah.
But she, as a storm coming, I know, and she drives off, and you see the photo taken that will then be passed from John to Kyle. And I think that's a perfect place to leave a film that we would look back on now as a classic. The problem with bringing back Terminator 2 is, as good as it is in places, and yes, it does tie everything up, it tells you there's more in this world. And because you've made it on a blockbuster budget and then got blockbuster returns from it, you are inviting more.
Yeah.
It took them a long time to get to it. They didn't do another one for 12 years after this.
But it's not just the Terminator that's kind of, to me, redundant after Part 2. I think Arnold himself, certainly after True Lies, his career never quite... Because he has Last Action Hero, which is a bit of a wobble, but he comes back with True Lies, which is fantastic. And on the back of that, I think he's there by a star again, which is why Warner's and Joel Schumacher get him for Batman and Robin. But after that, from 1999 onwards, till 2003, when he becomes governor, all the way up to Terminator 3, which is sort of his farewell to movies piece, it's very redundant stuff. There are attempts at something more profound with things like Collateral Damage, which is another one that suffers from the 9/11 thing. The End of Days thing is just woeful. I can't even... I mean, it's funny, but you can't really watch it. More than once as a sort of as a joke even. The fact of the matter is, the remarkable point about his story is that he would, and indeed still could, barring age, have been a remarkable president, which is what people talked about. But if he had to do that, the thing to do would have been to have campaigned for the constitutional amendment. They even joke about it in Demolition Man, which is a direct call-out with the Stallone rivalry. And he never did it. And I think Terminator 3 is to some extent forgivable because it's like his...
You don't know what we're talking about. To become you can become a senator, a governor, and everything else as a naturalized American.
But you can't become president.
You have to be American-born or born to Americans.
Yeah.
Ted Cruz was born in Canada, but he had American parents and American citizenship from birth.
Which seems a shame because it's a country that's built on
immigration.
But I think he could so easily have done it if he'd applied himself. Now, in retrospect, it may well have been that, like anybody, you have to build these things over time, and maybe the expectation was that he would do so as governor. But as he discovered, I mean, I've read his autobiography. It's an outstanding piece of writing.
Okay.
As a motivational book, if nothing. I mean, just the final chapter where he gives his sort of life lessons.
Yeah, you could think he was the worst actor in the world. You could think he was the worst politician in the world.
Yeah.
But you've got to be impressed by this guy's
versatility,
attitude, and what he's achieved.
Precisely. And the thing is, many of the... I mean, I wouldn't agree with all of his political points. He makes certain points about teaching, for example, which he doesn't quite... I don't think he quite gets the point about, and he is quite... his capitalism is, at least it's clear, and it's a point of principle that, he's on the one hand a fan of, I suppose, the American equivalent to austerity, but on the other hand, he is somebody who has quite compassionate and pastoral views about inclusion.
He doesn't sound like a modern Republican now.
No, he's got sort of Democrat values, which I think were perhaps...
But then he was married into the Kennedy family.
He was until... I mean, without going into people's private lives, I was so amused. Do you remember this when the story broke about him having the child with his mate? It's an unfortunate story, and it could happen to anybody without judging or whatever it is. But when the story broke, and I don't know how accurate this is, but as I understand it, what happened was that Maria Shriver, his then wife, literally, I think she was looking out the garden window one day or something, because the maid had obviously a house on the premises, and they'd had their kids at the same time. And I think the kid was walking up the drive or something, and Maria Shriver waved to the kid. And the kid put a thumbs up and smiled at her. And she just had this sort of eureka moment where she just went, shit! It's Arnie's kid, because there's no disguising the fact that as the kid got bigger. The thumbs up and the smile, which is so distinctively Arnie, it's almost genetic. It just, and that was the thing which kind of gave it away.
But I mean, the bit I almost sort of forgot to say earlier on Arnold Schwarzenegger is, I sort of had a eureka moment with him of my own, in that I don't think he's the rangiest actor in the world by any means, and I think certainly a lot of his late 90s output was sign, a bit like Stallone had at one time, although Stallone can always go back to the Rocky franchise, of what to do with a guy when your muscles are no longer a big sales attribute anymore, because cinema's changed, but also you've got older. But the eureka moment I had was back in the days of the Pick a Flick podcast. We covered Masters of the Universe, which, spoiler alert, Arnold Schwarzenegger is not in, but who is in it is Dolph Lundgren, who was a sort of Arnie-alike Eastern European, big muscles, limited range actor.
Yeah, and also a high achiever, because he had a PhD, didn't he?
Yes, deeply intelligent man. He's very, very qualified mechanical engineer. But he's the lead in the film, and yet he's got no presence. He disappears in his own film. And in reviewing that film, I said, God, I'm so appreciative of Arnold Schwarzenegger now, because you can look at it from a technical perspective and say, not much of an actor, but my God, does he grab a screen by the balls?
Yeah.
I've got quite a lot of respect for the guy. His politics are not my politics. His morality is not my morality. Who am I to judge? And he pulled himself up from nothing.
Yeah, and he is a movie star. There's no question, and that's why unquestioningly, I can actually watch and indeed enjoy bits of, if not the whole, obviously not the whole of it, but bits of both Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines and Terminator Genesis. And it is also why, for all of its actually underrated merits, of which there are actually some, Terminator Salvation is just lacking something, and the thing it's lacking is Arnie, because he is that world. He is the poster boy for Terminator. Without him, even as he gets old...
They haven't ever learned to do the series without him, if indeed it's even possible. Certainly Terminator 3, the best viewing I ever had of that film was my first. I went to see it sort of opening weekend.
Yeah.
Not in a mad sort of hype. It's not like I was like, it opens next week, It was almost like I was hanging out with some people, and it was out that weekend. It was like, let's go see it. And I went to see it, and I mean, it's a pale rehash of the second film, and also plot-wise, you drive a coach and horses through it. It's extraordinarily ordinary. But on first viewing, it was great, because it was quite a ride. There was plenty of action in it, and it was a good bit of fun. And Arnold Schwarzenegger is properly fucking funny in it.
He is. It is a funny film. And the thing is, what people forgot a little bit, who were slightly overcritical of it, I thought, was the idea that it is possible to reverently watch episodes of franchise. We talked about this with Bond earlier on. You can very possibly, because ultimately these things are fiction. It's not like The Fate of a Nation where someone makes a policy decision that actually affects lives. If somebody makes a terrible sequel to something, it doesn't actually, contrary to popular belief, devalue or disrespect what went before it. It just means that it didn't work. But if you look at that film on its merits, you get to enjoy a little bit more of him as the Terminator, which people did want to see, and which he wanted, and which even James Cameron, who didn't want to make a third, said to one, he said, just go and do it, take the money and enjoy it. And he was happy for him to do that. I think that I love the bit. I love the joke with talk to the hand with the stripper. I shouldn't love it.
It was dated by the time the film came out, but that was funny. I think the bit where he's driving the car and he tries to calm Kate down.
Yes.
That's funny. He virtually fucking barks at her.
Yes. I think there are things it does very well. I think the ending is a huge shock. Do you remember the ending?
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
I thought the ending was probably ballsy, actually.
Yeah. And I think also, do you remember what you were saying earlier on as well about the idea that if you make this character too much of a goodie, it's actually quite boring. Well, one of the good things, once again, that Terminator 3 does accomplish is the fact that, yes, we're enjoying more of comedy Arnold, nice Terminator, but the fact that he can switch, that he can be corrupted, I think is quite interesting. And I enjoy it.
I don't think that was particularly well done, but we are watching it in the knowledge that model actually kills John.
Yeah, which is interesting.
That very one, not just the model line.
Yeah.
Kills John.
But I think the reason it ultimately...
He passionately sells him, it's like I was chosen due to your attachment to my model as a child.
Which once again, if we go back to what we were saying about, Spectre, does happen in reality, in the sense that if, for example, I don't know, a family member or an old friend you meet again or something turns out to have changed, as people do, and they've changed not for the better, and there's nothing you can do about it, it's tragic and it hurts, and it is a weakness if you're sentimental about an era or a person and you desperately try to recreate that later in life. It's a moral movie in itself. Don't go there, because it won't happen. You will be, occasionally, yes, things happen just out of the blue by magic, and occasionally, yes, people do not disappoint and they turn out to be decent for all of life and you stay in touch forever. But a lot of the time, that's actually a weakness, not a strength. And I think Terminator in a split second does capture that quite well in Terminator 3, where he sort of says, look, yeah, based on the fact that as a kid you got attached to this model, we as a machine race were able to say that's our weakness, that's what we can strike him with. And it would work like that, because you would want to give it a hug or something, and that's what kills you, which is interesting.
It is nonsense, because the TX is a step back from the T1000 and all that sort of thing.
She is very sexy, though.
I'm not going to pretend it's a great film, but I will say, without any shame, that the first time I saw it on the big screen, I had a great time with it.
Which is an endorsement of a sort, because it means that if somebody not that I'm saying that people listen to this wanting recommendations as such, but if they haven't seen Terminator 3 and they see it for the first time, you're guaranteed a good time. You won't be dissatisfied with it. If you pick
the first big action sequence where he's being he's on a crane and being forced through buildings and stuff like that. Just during that, I was thinking, I think I've already got the price of admission here.
Yeah, in a way that today we maybe don't always get.
Were low.
But what it lacks is obviously the technological innovation of 1 or 2. It
lacks any innovation, frankly. The one thing that film did was it was properly funny without unbalancing the film, and it had a really ballsy ending.
Yeah,
quite a workaday film and filmmaker. That is an endorsement.
I think the way that it... I mean, I'm sort of contradicting myself here, having said that it doesn't matter when a sequel disregards protocol of sorts, but what it does in one line to Sarah Connor about leukemia, well, it doesn't feel right. I mean, obviously people do die of natural causes, and that's fine, but that's just not the franchise to do it in, because the whole point of a Terminator film is it's a struggle against an outside force, and you are defined by whether you die or survive against that, and she was defined as a survivor against that.
I think as well, this is a small point, and in a film I love, if it was a film I loved, I don't even think I'd raise this, but I do find the language of cancer kind of offensive, in that it's subtly victim blaming, because it's a battle to be fought. And we're told that she survived an extra 3 years past Judgment Day, which means she must have been diagnosed immediately after Terminator 2. She survived for like 3 years to see Judgment Day out, and then she gave in to the cancer. And I've always hated that type of terminology around cancer.
But that's the social politics of the day. We all talk about the battle against cancer.
It's still the social politics now. I don't like it.
I mean, I visited hospices where they sort of said, look, it's not a fight, because we didn't choose to have this.
No, it's not that. I'll tell you the best quote I've ever heard on it is Danny Baker, the DJ, when he was asked about it, because he had head, neck and throat cancer, I think it was. And he was asked a question in an interview that I saw where he was asked about the battle against cancer. He said, I didn't battle cancer. He said, I was the battlefield.
Interesting.
And that's the way to think about it. Yeah.
And they also talk about contracting it. You don't contract it.
It's almost the idea that if you're made of the right fortitude, you'll do better against cancer, which is just not the case.
It's not acceptable, really. But it's one of those things that's just there. And I think, as I say, there are many movies that still make that mistake. I mean, one of the reasons instantly this put me off the film, I'll probably watch it again when it's ready for download, but I wanted to walk out of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 when, spoiler alert, but everyone's probably seen it already, the Ego, the Living Planet, says, oh, and I had to give your mother that cancer. Yeah. And I just thought, why go there? Why do that? I mean, by all means have him as the murderer of the mother. By all means have her die of natural causes. But to weaponize the word cancer like that as a kind of a storytelling device, I've always had problems. I have exactly the same problems as you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, funnily enough, in that case, I kind of accepted it because it nauseated me and it was meant to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just don't like that terminology against cancer because of all the people. I podcast with a certain number of people here. Statistically, some of us will get cancer one day, and the idea that it's all in our hands as to how we do against that cancer, I find offensive.
Yeah, but look, if you have cancer, I give you the day off, or a week off. Just part of the anti-cancer
lobby. But remember to fight it.
Yeah, fight to the death, and that talking of fight, salvation. I kind of like it. I do. I mean, as I say, it lacks Arnie. It lacks a certain, I don't know. It lacks a certain something. It feels very redundant. It looks like The Matrix meets Saving Private Ryan, but as an action-adventure film, kind of works. It's a satisfying film. I think Christian Bale's pretty good in it. I think Worthington's all right in it.
In my life, I've been duped by the talk of a filmmaker leading up to it because I wasn't a fan of him. Jay didn't rate him as a filmmaker at all.
Yeah.
Although his Charlie's Angels films are bizarrely quite a lot of fun. But, he's not a dour filmmaker. He's actually quite a lot of fun. But I wasn't a great fan of his, and I certainly thought he was a bad fit for the Terminator universe. Now, he talked in the lead-up about his reverence for the original ones and that he knew he was a controversial choice. He also said something about if it turns out R-rated, it turns out R-rated, and that'll be all right. Frankly, apart from a deleted scene of Moon Bloodgood topless.
Where is that? Is that available on the Blu-ray?
It's on the DVD.
Just so for completing, just to make sure that obviously I've seen as much of the film as is artistically possible.
You see Moon Bloodgood's tits in it.
Yes.
But apart from that, the action is shot in such a way that film was never going for an R rating.
No.
So he kind of misled people there a little bit.
And it lacks the time travel dimension.
The positive of the positives of the film, Anton Yelchin is an absolutely uncanny John Connor. I was stunned.
You mean Kyle Reese?
Sorry?
You mean Kyle Reese?
What did I say?
Bale is John Connor.
Sorry, did I say John Connor? I did mean Kyle Reese.
Although the reason that happened, Christian Bale was supposed to be Kyle Reese. They said, no, I want to be John Connor. So they made him John Connor.
So that unbalances the film in and of itself because John Connor is meant to be a much more minor character in the film, heard largely over radio. That was meant to be, but of course Christian Bale kept pushing for more and more and more.
Yes.
And it just unbalanced the film, and the film kind of ended up going nowhere. I thought it was interesting to look at. I thought Anton Yelchin, sorry to correct myself this time, was an uncanny Kyle Reese.
Yeah.
I was back in this period where they started putting Sam Worthington in everything, and I've just found him the most horrendous charisma bypass. What he's like now, I don't know. I mean, because people do sort of their screen yeah, their screen persona can change with age.
Yep.
So let's see how he does in sort of the Avatar sequels and everything else. But back then, I just thought this is a bad idea.
He screen tested for Bond, didn't he?
And I thought he did. He was in the final 5.
Bizarre. I can't picture it, but I mean, hey.
No, I can't. The final 5 when they cast Daniel Craig, for those of you who don't listen to my other show, it was him, Worthington, Henry Cavill, Daniel Craig, obviously, Goran Visnich, who's best known for ER,
Blimey.
and the guy who was in the Hawaii Five-0 remake.
Right.
Whose name suddenly escapes me.
Yes. So there's a lot of Bond connections, everything, because Worthington comes back for Wrath of the Titans, doesn't he?
Yes.
Clash of the Titans, you've got Gemma Austin, who was a divine Bond girl, Strawberry Field. And in the second one, Wrath of the Titans, you've got Rosamund Pike. Rosamund Pike.
Who died the other day.
Who's dying the other day. I actually auditioned once with her, just to go off topic there. I auditioned with Rosamund Pike once at Oxford. And it was for a play, I think it was Henry V. And I was dead keen to be Henry V. And Gladiator had just been released, so I'd just literally seen Russell Crowe, and I thought, that's my Henry V. So I got my hair cut like it. And I'd been posing in the mirror for days, learning the speech. But then I'm set up as this vision of an actress. And I couldn't concentrate quite as well for the life of me. And when the feedback came on the audition, they said, James, you read that kind of like a rugby coach rather than Henry V. And I tried to spin my way out of it. And I said, yeah, well, that's how I see Prince Hal. And then they said, but you also seemed quite distracted.
I was actually, I thought you were going to sort of go the Bowfinger route, where you would have said, can we try that again this time without the erection?
Well, no, it wasn't quite that, but if it was, I mean, I'm told it was Rosamund. It was sort of one of those urban myths akin to, I mean, many of my friends have said, no, you did screen test, but there were certain other rumours which I haven't told people to disavow or anything, but they at the time anyway, they were about the fact that I wanted to conquer Hollywood or whatever. I do not have those delusions, but Rosamund, I could tell immediately, had a professionalism about how she was approaching her acting in a way that I just couldn't. And I think it was at that point where I kind of thought to myself, I'm never going to be a professional actor because I can't, if I'm opposite a leading lady who's that lovely, I just can't concentrate because I'm thinking, oh, you're lovely. And second, there are people who are just not so much born to do it, but have in them, I think, a professionalism in how they approach acting. They're not doing an impression of an actor.
And that porcelain doll persona is very much your kryptonite.
Is it?
Well, it is when you think about the Nicole Kidmans and the Rosamund Pikes. And
I've never thought of that, Lee. God, you know me. Are you the author of all my pain? It was you all along, wasn't it?
Yes, it was me.
I was behind that audition. I sent Rosamund to Oxford. And also, the final connection there is that Rosamund was...
I'll tell you what, if I had Rosamund Pike to share, that would be sent to me away.
She's amazing. I mean, she was amazing in Gone Girl. She got better as an actress as she's gone on.
Yeah, that's the thing. She did a Bond film 10 years before she would have been...
Yeah. She'd have been... I mean, she would be a fantastic Tracy now. Having watched Gone Girl, because Gone Girl is where she's basically playing this very complicated character. But she was considered for the Terminatrix in Terminator 3 as well, as was Gwyneth Paltrow, another porcelain perfect Hitchcock. It'd be funny though. She could goop him to death or something like that. Give the Terminator a goop recipe. But her cookbooks are actually very good. That's the thing.
Rosamund Pike could have done it, actually.
Yeah, and probably would have enjoyed it. Would have enjoyed the exposure. I mean, Gwyneth's...
The Terminator Salvation was, I just thought, a mess. I thought it looked interesting, but it was spectacularly done.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't seen it for years now.
But they extend the universe without really extending it. You don't actually get...
Don't they can't... Right, so they... Okay. I think the machines have Kyle Reese. And it's to draw in John Connor. So they're using their number 2 target to get their number 1 target. Or it might be the other way around, I forget which. But all they got to do is kill Kyle Reese and John Connor never fucking exists. It's spectacularly stupid. It goes into... It tries to go a little stage deeper to deepen the lore, but it doesn't have the intelligence to do it. And actually it ends up making quite a mess of itself.
It's overcomplicated. I mean, if the machines were that clever, they'd have simply found a way to wipe out humanity and win. It's that simple. If they were able to cross and double-cross.
Terminator Genesis, I think it was the line, we've got to get to the future as soon as possible, that best reflects that film's IQ.
It's one of the, on the one hand, it's one of the, prima facie, it's one of the shittest films ever made. And it's so lazy. And it is so full of milking the images from better films with none of the innovation or imagination. On the other hand, there are moments, yet again moments, that are enjoyable on their own merits. And yes, taking it too far into comedy and so on, not a good idea. There is one moment for me that stands out where just for a split second you get that old vibe, which is when Arnold walks into the hospital with the teddy bear. And you just think, are they getting back to that kind of, what I was describing earlier, that Robert Darby walk, where you just don't know, is he a goodie or a baddie? Is he going to open a box that has something? Can he be corrupted or whatever it is? And I think it was, people whinge about the fact that they went to social media or tech. Well, that's an obvious challenge. It doesn't cohere with the fact that Terminators are a visceral, physical, animalistic, oiled machine. They are not artificial intelligence, but on the other hand, they are sourced by an artificial intelligence. And in an era of Facebook and so on, and especially that year, I think Jason Bourne, the following year as well, went down the obvious social media route. Many of the film franchises are kind of hinging on it. But I think in terms of looking forward as well, one of the things they may have to do, ironically enough, for a time travel piece is make it a period piece, because it belongs in the 80s. It belongs in that kind of oil and grit and piston charge sort of tech on the cusp, but not in a kind of an era of, oh, the Terminator is now a virus, just a computer virus. It didn't work.
Or Skynet is anyway.
Yeah, well, Skynet, that's the source, but
the worst type of countdown films is when you don't know what the countdown represents.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about Spectre earlier, and Nine Eyes had a countdown on it to it going live. Well, what would have happened had it gone live, and then 5 minutes later we just unplugged it again? What does it? We're not sold what the stakes of that hitting zero on the countdown clock is. I'm not quite sure. The Terminator film, for having had the benefit of seeing the previous films and knowing that Judgment Day happened as soon as they became self-aware, we can possibly infer, just with the help of previous films, that this thing going live is a severe danger. But we're not really shown how. So what? It's a new sort of social media platform. Okay, and?
Yeah, what's it going to do? It wasn't. I mean, at least it's not going to set off nukes or whatever it is. But to be honest, I knew from day one. I say this, little I can say this hand on heart. I knew it wasn't going to work. I knew it wasn't going to hit. I watched it almost out of a sense of loyalty to Arnold.
Oh, I went to see it. I went to see it, and I went to see it quickly. I got in quickly to see it.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't going to be around. But on the other hand,
I knew it was going to be a problem when we started getting to trailers, and they showed the big John Connor reveal.
Yeah, which gave away the whole thing.
Well, for all of trailers showing too much, and it is a general problem anyway, when it's of that degree, when a film gives away its major twist, that is desperation. That is piss poor test screenings and word of mouth. This is, tracking for the studio, showing it's not going to do that well. And so they panic and throw a bit more into the trailer to try and sort of rescue it from being a complete dumpster fire. And I think that was the first sign for me. Once I saw that in the trailer, I thought they've got a turkey.
Yeah, and I think it was kind of there was almost an acceptance that this reboot was going to be rebooted. Everybody knew, almost with a sort of a divine retrospective knowledge, that it was only a matter of time before this property would get sold anyway, which is why Paramount wanted to make one pretty quickly.
Oh, it's been being moved all over the place, hasn't it? Because, I mean, it was Carol Co., and then they went bust, and then I think 3 or 4, I forget which, was like Halcyon or something like that. Yeah. They're up for auction every few years, and of course they're only sublet anyway, because the original deal is they revert to James Cameron in next year or the year after.
So Cameron now has them. Cameron he's not going to direct, he's not necessarily going to write, but he's certainly producing. He is godfathering the next iteration of this series.
I think he will be reasonably hands-on as much as he can with his schedule.
Yeah. And
I don't think he'll second guess a director. I think he'll give them freedom, but I think whatever pitch there's going to be for that film will have to get past him.
Yeah, and I think, as I understand it, they're not going to make the mistake which Genesis and to some extent Salvation made of sort of immersing itself in its own mythology. It's not going to be a reboot either, but what they're going to do is involve Arnold in an in-universe contextual way, which explains A, why he's older, but B, why these machines look like him. And I think that is an interesting starting point.
There is a deleted scene on Rise of the Machines.
Sergeant Candy. Is that the one you're talking
Sergeant
about?
Candy, yeah.
We're just going to forget that. That didn't happen. Rebooted.
Don't like the voice, we can fix that.
Yes. But so I think more along the lines of, was this a scientist or something, or was it somebody who had something to do with Skynet?
We saw him as Victor Freeze doing some high danger science work. So
yeah, and he does convince us that, and I think it could work. And the other thing is, with the world we're in at the moment, where nuclear threats have become a thing again, you get back that sense of tension about which perhaps the world was a bit more complacent during the previous 3 iterations of this franchise. And that makes it interesting. We now face global Armageddon, potentially, not necessarily in reality.
We're not saying it's going to happen, but it's certainly a concern in the way that a Terminator film 12 to 15 years ago just didn't have that.
Precisely. And I think with that in mind, and with the fact that however advanced technology has become, these old threats come back. And also there are real, we see with the hurricane at the moment, you can have a threat that is natural, that comes from nowhere, that people still have to respond to. And I think if they can get back to a sense that these are films at their core about the thriller of survival, and you focus on the thriller, and maybe even the horror, Armageddon dimension to it, and you bring back that simplicity, I think that's the way to go with it.
Yes, but having said that, the first film took Judgment Day as a bit of an inevitability.
Yeah.
Because there's no fate, but what we make for ourselves isn't in what John Connor says to her in the first film. That in itself is a retcon. It's just talking about how she's going to have to be stronger than she ever thought possible. And thank you for your service through the dark years and stuff like that. The first film was about stopping a threat to a young woman who can't even comprehend the threat to her. It wasn't about Judgment Day and stopping Judgment Day. That was an inevitable something that was going to happen 12, 15 years hence. In fact, I don't think we even knew the date from the first film.
Yeah.
We just knew that 2029, he went back to 1984, and he tells her at different points, this whole place just isn't here in my time.
And philosophically, that's interesting. The idea of, is this an event that has to happen? Is this an event that we keep making happen? Or is it something that is a fixed point in time that once you stop, it stops?
But the first film is smart to not even try to address that.
Yeah.
I mean, the second film kind of gives a degree of hope, which I like. I mean, for all the things that I think the first is a better film, I think the second film was wise in just going, you had Miles Dyson say, well, aren't we changing things now? And we never fully answer that question. We just have there's some hope. The third film postulates Justice Day. Judgment Day is inevitable, which kind of pisses on the second one a little bit, but okay.
Well, it gives it kind of a mystical quality, if anything.
The first film doesn't even bother with it. The first film just says there's going to be a nuclear event at some point in time, which in the early 80s, at the point when this would have been written, I think possibly would have been the sort of default opinion of people, that there's bound to be some nuclear something at some point. It's not about stopping that, it's not about questioning it, and it's not about worldwide stakes in the time of the story. It's just about keeping this woman alive so she can give humanity hope down the line through her son. And it's actually, the stakes are just as high because it's humanity's future, but it's not high stakes like Terminator 2 where we're literally trying to stop the end of the world.
Yeah.
And I like it for that, and I think
it's high noon. It's high noon with sci-fi, because one of the things they say in film school. One of the things they say in film school, if you want to write a good script, one of the great scripts of all time is high noon. You've got an imminent confrontation. You don't tell the audience necessarily all the details about why or the backstory or the wherefores, but you set it up so clearly and with such kind of precision that the tension is there, that the character comes through.
At the very start of this show, you don't have to explain everything.
Yes, even though I did kind of, and added another 15 minutes of exposition to it. But
well,
hey,
you can explain everything because we're here to educate and inform.
That's right. That's right. This is for non-for-profit.
Themselves don't have to.
We can make it for profit when people want to, download it for money or whatever it is.
The first film is not weaker because we don't know whether Judgment Day is an inevitability. We don't know how it kicks off. We don't know when it's going to be, and we don't know whether Sarah will be alive for it. We assume not, because she's a memory by the time. She's a photograph and a memory by the time an adult Carl, comes on the scene. And none of that matters because the story is just about survival against not only a threat like a slasher, but a threat in slasher style. When you think about like a Freddy Krueger, those kids aren't really believed. There's just something happening, but of course it's not bloody dreams, you know.
But that's another hallmark of great filmmaking, is that you, on the one hand, you've got a simple premise that's derivative, but you do something interesting with it by maybe splicing genres, maximum of 2 together. You do something interesting with a genre that's otherwise dormant, and you kind of inject something new. And if the next Terminator film can manage to do that, then of course it won't ever quite reach the peak of 1 or indeed 2. But I think it will.
It's got such a high bar. I mean,
yeah, but it will. But they've got a good chance, at least with Cameron on board and Arnie in whatever capacity. Obviously, it's too late for him to be doing quite the same shtick as he was in those first 2. But if we get Arnie the actor, who does, I mean, you look at Killing Gunther, which is hilarious from the looks of things, and you look at that one he did recently about the plane vengeance story. I can't remember the title of it. And you look at was it Maggie, the zombie one? He can act. Not Laurence Olivier standard by his own admission, but as we were saying earlier on, if they give him something that's relevant and good to do in context, and they keep that essential simplicity, that horror, that tension, that sense of, yes, there's a wider mythology, but no, we're not going to make a fan fiction love letter to that and get bogged down in it like Genesis did, and to some extent Salvation, even Part 3. We're just going to get on with that. I think they can deliver, and I think it can work again. And I am genuinely curious to see what they do with it, and I'm interested in it. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, so many series going through my head now. We talked about Aliens, how I wish it had finished after Aliens.
There's an entire podcast in that. We can certainly go.
Forget the quality of what's come. It's a bit like saying Roger Moore should have quit after Moonraker. Well, I believe that, but we wouldn't have got For Your Eyes Only, which I love. So
yeah.
It's not saying that everything after I would have guillotined it's been dreadful. But I feel this way about a lot of things in this world. But we talked about the Rocky films recently. There's going to be a Creed 2.
Yeah.
I don't want a Creed 2, but I'll go and see it, and I'll watch it with an open mind. And I'm the same with Terminator. For goodness sake, please stop. But if you're not going to stop, and you aren't going to stop, let's be honest, let's see how good we can make it.
The one thing I would say about Creed 2 that's encouraging is that I think what Stallone is going to do with that is give the best of both worlds. Because if you look at Rocky Balboa and to some extent look at Creed, one of the things that was missing, if you're a fan of the Rocky iteration from Rocky 3 and 4, where he's basically a superhero, and that's the Rocky that you remember, there was that aspect to it was missing. If, however, you prefer Rocky 1, Rocky 2, and Rocky Balboa, and to some extent Creed, that sense of drama, that can also be catered for. So as I understand it, he's going the Godfather 2 approach, and they're going to splice a prequel story with Creed, the young man, the dad, actual Apollo Creed, with the continuation with Adonis, and the Adonis versus Drago thing will give you the kind of the super heroics and the gloss, and the prequel will be the more gritty boxer on the rise story. If they do it right, if it's well directed, I think it could work, but who knows? Well, there you go. So, but our next one is obviously we're looking at the Blair movies, the Blair trilogy, the Stephen Frears and.
So what's that? That's The Deal, The Queen. I don't know which order they're in. And The Special Relationship. What's the correct order of them?
It's The Deal is the one that starts it off, which is
so it's The Deal, The Queen, and then The Special Relationship.
Yeah, and I think that Stephen Frears and Peter Morgan developed the first two. I don't think Peter Morgan necessarily. I don't think Stephen Frears directs all 3. I'll just do a quick check here. But they have.
Very surprised if he did.
Michael Sheen is obviously the common denominator. He's
the common link. Yes.
Yeah. And they're all very good.
I didn't give up from any sense of not enjoying it, but I was doing other things. I got about 3/4 of an hour into the ghostwriting yesterday.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's the sort of the postscript one where we look at Pierce playing a very thinly disguised Tony Blair. So to be continued. We will do that, and I think it's relevant because people are still talking about Blair. Blair is still relevant. Blair also traded a lot on Cinemacraft. By his own admission, he channeled a little bit of Hugh Grant, circa 4 Weddings. There was a bit of the Brosnan Bond, the way that he sort of presented himself occasionally, and they certainly came on the scene at the same time. So nostalgia-wise, at a cinema level, and politically, it's interesting. If we can get Terry Bamber back, because I know that he loves talking about the Blair era, it's certainly something that fascinates him. And if not, you and me will bosh it out. We'll fight it out, Blair to the death.
Would you up this next weekend to do that one? So that'll be, episode 4 then of Politflix?
I've lost count. We'll just call it The Phantom Menace or something.
Oh, no, sorry, this is episode 4 because I've been on This is the third I've been on, and you did do one with.
We'll call it.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, we'll call it a Politflix story. That way we don't have to episode number it. We'll reboot the franchise. So a few show notes. Obviously, movieviral.com is still there. We're using the podcast more because it consolidates a lot of the news topics and some of the retrospective features through talk rather than spending ages typing it up and sharing it and being humiliated because someone else has done it first because the news has got old or whatever it is. Makes us more troll-proof and is a lot more fun and keeps it as a hobby with possible spin-off and networking. So keep looking out for these. We will keep them coming. Anybody else from the thing I want to plug? Oh yes, Gwyneth Paltrow, her cookery books are available and they are very good. And to all you people who hate Goop, yes, it's frustrating, annoying, but she means well and she's lovely. So sort of. Dave, where can we find you?
You can find me at the Personally Kid 1976 on Twitter. You can find my other regular podcast, You Expect Us to Talk, at Expect Us to Talk on Twitter or facebook.com/Expect Us to Talk, and that's the film retrospective show we've referred to a few times during this recording.
Fabulous. So hope you enjoyed it, wherever you are in the world. Obviously, thoughts very much with anyone in Texas at the moment. I know for a fact that I don't necessarily know if there are listeners there, but I've got a number of Facebook friends there who've all been frightfully nice to me and have had many film chats and so on. So all I can say is my thoughts are with you, much as that's a very overused phrase. It is very genuine at this stage. So I hope
all I can say is you can vote Democrat, folks.
Yes, because that's what caused it. Trump made this happen. Enough. We're being taken off air. This is the Resistance. Take care, Dave. See you next week.
Good night, folks.
God bless. Thanks so much. 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 So much.